Hello buzzers, John here, and we're going to talk about blueness, how you can use the color blue to enhance your images. Now hopefully you've read Andrew's article on this subject, because this kind of dovetails into that and follows on from that in some respects. So what I want to look at are 3 different ways you can use the controls in a RAW converter like Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw to actually enhance the blue content of your pictures. And this first example, I've got here a still life, a rather abstracted still life. And the fact that it's abstract is quite important because within this shot, there are no real references. What it evokes is a sort of a high-tech feel, that cool blueness looking quite technical and a little bit scientific. All we've actually got though are some water drops applied with the paintbrush on a CD and then a small pen torch shone across the CD to use it as a beam splitter effectively and get a prism effect in the light reflections here. But those 2 elements combined together with the very shallow depth of field from a macro lens produces quite a high-tech picture. And that's how I wanted it to look, that kind of blue sheen. Because what I've done is reduce the color temperature on this. That's all. This is kind of a one-slider job. Once you've processed the image and got it looking how you like in terms of its highlights and shadows and contrast, all that's involved is a global shift in the color temperature. So effectively, I'm resetting the white balance that it was originally shot on. And we can look at the original capture very quickly by just moving the temperature slider or setting the white balance back to its daylight setting. So we go back to daylight and we can see very clearly this is a shot of some water drops on a CD. And there's a light source on the CD giving these nice kind of prismatic spectrum colors diffused in the background. So that looks like a CD, but when we reduce the color temperature, and in this case, I've gone to a tungsten balance. So this is the kind of balance that you'd use for indoor lighting. We go to tungsten and we get that nice blue hue coming through, which changes the mood completely. But the important thing with this, the reason we can get away with that shift in white balance to create a different mood is because there's no real context. There's no references within the picture for us to latch onto to say, hang on, that's a skin tone, that should be this color, or hang on, that's this color. There's nothing there for us to lock onto to realize that it's the wrong color temperature. So you can get away with that with abstracts and with many still lifes, and you can even get away with it with things like rock and roll shots where there may be very bold, colorful lighting used to illuminate the performers. So that's one way. Simply move the color temperature slider once you've processed the image and get a completely new look and a new mood for an image. Okay, so that's one. I'm just going to close that down in the RAW converter and we'll have a look at a different image now with a different kind of flavor. Okay, well here's a shot taken in a little fishing harbor in Hong Kong. That period just after sunset and before twilight where things all go an interesting shade of blue. But it's not that apparent in the original picture because of course at the time I was using the daylight, or rather I think the cloudy or shade white balance. So that white balance setting has warmed everything up and kind of neutralized the picture, knocked out the very blueness that was there in the first place. So we've got the neutral shot now as the camera captured it, trying to neutral the tones. But if I just decrease the color temperature and take it towards the blue end of the scale, it all goes a bit wrong because every color becomes affected and it just doesn't look like a blue hour picture. What we really want to do is just modify the blues and aquas and those cyan kind of colors and not mess about too much with the actual color fidelity of the yellows and reds and other things in the picture. We probably need to reduce their impact in the picture so we get that sense of blueness, but we don't want to start spoiling them because otherwise all these tungsten lights and this neon sign, they all get corrupted by the blue wash that we're applying to the entire image. So let's not do it that way. Let's instead just restore our white balance to, I think it was the shade setting. Yeah, so that's how it was captured, and that's where it is. Everything's grey instead of blue and has gone very, very neutral. So instead of just moving the temperature slider about with this kind of image where you do have lots of context within it, what you want to do is go into the Hue, Saturation and Luminance tab. You'll find that in Lightroom and in Adobe Camera Raw. It's this one here. Just click on that slider and you see the HSL adjustments. So there's the 3, Hue, Saturation and Luminance. We're not too bothered about luminance. That's going to make particular colors lighter or darker. And we're not too bothered about hue because that's going to change the color of specific colors in the image. The one we want to look at only is saturation because that's going to have the best impact in this kind of situation. What we want to do to get the kind of mood that we experienced, and most importantly, the kind of mood that we want the viewer to experience, is we need to beef up the blues and the aquas. If we increase the saturation of those two colors, we should start to get that blueness coming through without causing too much damage to anything else in the shot. So all we're going to do is make sure we're on the saturation sub-tab here, and then we're just going to start cranking up the blues a little bit. Let's just take them half height. That's a little bit there. That's good. Aquas will do the same thing because that's that kind of greeny blue that also registers quite well in the blue range. So we'll just beef those up, and that's now giving us more of a sense of the blue hour. There's those blue tones coming through, but they're not killing the image. They're not overpowering it in the way that the color temperature slider did. And while we're enhancing individual colors, the other thing we can do is suppress some of the bolder colors here, so we help our blues to dominate more subtly. And that means taking kind of the yellows, reds, and oranges down a fraction. And we can do that just by using these same sliders. So if we move yellows all the way to the left, we see we start killing that yellow content. So we're going to take that about down halfway, something like that. We'll do the same with oranges, and we'll just suppress some of those colors. You see this boat in the foreground starts losing its saturation there. And if we do the same to the reds, we're now getting, in the overall balance, more of a sense of blueness because we're not being distracted too much by the other colors. So what we're effectively doing is restricting our color palette a little bit within the scene. We're suppressing some colors and making sure others are a little louder just so they cut through more and give more of a sense of the picture. Now I think that's enough with the color mix, so I'm going to go back to the basic tab now. And back here, all I'm going to do is make a slight tweak on the color temperature. So that's going to affect the image globally, but if I just take that down, it's at 7500 at the moment. If I just take it down just a gnat, down to about 6500, I get quite a strong sense of blueness now coming through because of the adjustments I've made in the HSL tab. And that now really feels like blue hour. So quite subtle changes to the color balance, and then a little tweak on color temperature. And I'm still on 6500 Kelvin, so I'm still much warmer than normal daylight, but we have that blue sense coming through, all through the use of the individual color sliders in the hue, saturation, and luminance tab. So that's method 2, where you're not making a big global change using color temperature, you're just boosting the saturation of particular color values and suppressing some of the others just to allow a tone to subtly dominate a picture. Okay, so that's method number 2. So I'll close that down and I'll move on to a third method, which is really in the black and white realm. So we'll open up our third and final image, and that's a file shot on the streets of San Francisco. I've already converted it to mono, and I've already added a bit of blue toning. And for me, that has a real sense of Americana. I wouldn't say it's a cold shot. We're not trying to give a sense of coolness in temperature terms. We're just applying a traditional kind of cyanotype look, a traditional black and white toning process that introduces blueness into the midtones. So an easy way to look at what we've done is to remove it. So in this instance, with the black and white conversion made, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the split toning tab because that's where all the work can be done in a raw converter. So what we've got hue for the highlights, hue for the shadows, and saturation for both, and a balance slider. All I'm going to do is take the saturation out of both of those, and we go back to a neutral mono image. It looks quite warm initially because our eyes are already adjusting to the blueness, to the cool tones. That kind of warms it up and makes it look slightly towards the sepia, but it's not. That is neutral. That's just your eyes playing tricks on you. But to do single color toning, all you actually have to do is work on one of these. You've got hue and saturation. You only need one initially. The balance slider doesn't matter at the moment. I'm just going to set that to the highlight, so move it all the way to the right, and we can just set a hue and set a saturation using the highlight sliders. So in order to see what color we're going to use, we need some saturation in there, otherwise we have nothing. So I'm just going to take that up to about 50%, around about half height, and then I can move the hue to use whatever color toning I like. Now, if you want a traditional look, the general preference goes towards that sepia color, which is kind of that browny orange hue, or you go towards the cyanotype color, which is further up the scale in the blues, and that will give you the blue toning. So if we look at the sepia first of all, that looks okay, but like a lot of sepia stuff, it makes it look quite old and old-fashioned, like it's been taken 100 years ago or something. We'd have a bit less saturation in that. But with sepia, you get the idea or the impression of something from yesteryear, something that's quite historical and rather old. And that isn't really what I want for this shot, because this is only taken a few years ago. So instead, we can go for the cyanotype, and all that means is moving the hue all the way up into the blue register, normally around 220 to 240, that kind of zone there. If you push it too far, you'll see it start to turn purple. That means you've gone too far for blue toning. If you move it too far back and you run out of cyan, it starts going green. So really, it's between those two extremes. When it's not looking green and when it's not looking purple, you're in the blues at that point. And that's going to be sort of 200 to 240 or thereabouts in the hue value. In terms of saturation, it's kind of up to you. You can either go for what's known as a cool tone print, which is a very subtle blue cast. And normally that would be, in traditional black and white terms, it would actually be the base paper that's colored in that way, rather than any chemical extra you add to it to add the toning color. So cool toning will be somewhere in the 220s or 230s with a very low saturation value of sort of 8 to 12%, something like that. Whereas if you want that full-on cyanotype, you can just crank up the saturation and get it as high as you like until things start to look ridiculously blue. That's obviously too much there at a sort of a saturation level of 68%. You don't want to go beyond 40, whatever you do really, because it starts to look very, very artificial. So think of your minimum as about 10 and your maximum as about 40, and you just kind of pick the blue content you like the look of that really tells a story to you and to your viewer. But while I'm on the split toning tab, there are of course two options. And one thing I often like to do with images is what I call enriched toning. And that's where you don't use just a single color, you use a secondary color for the shadows that's closely related to the first color. So if, for example, we decide to go for, say, a 220 in the highlights, and we set our saturation, we'll just set it half height to get our color mix right. So we'll set that about 50. That's our basic starting point. In the shadows, we can then introduce a very similar color, ideally within about 30 points of our hue value, and that will give us a richer form of toning. So let's just set that. We're going to move the balance to about 50% so we can see both tonings going on at the same time. And then in the shadows, I'm going to set that. We've got 222 here, so let's move that up to sort of high 40s or something like that. That should do the trick there. So we've got a different color in the shadows than we have in the highlights. We're going towards the purples. We're on the edge of purple here in the shadows, but that's okay because now what we can do is just balance the two. So we know in the shadows, we've got that slightly bluey purple, and in the highlights, we've got the sort of the bold cyan. And by just mixing the two together, we can get a deeper sense of toning. And if you look at the midtones in particular, you can see where the crossover point happens. And that can be a really great way to introduce blueness to your black and white pictures by using that enriched toning process, where you've got very similar colors in the shadows and the highlights, but you balance the two together to give a more interesting result than you get by just using the highlights alone or the shadows alone. So it's very subtle split toning as opposed to sort of using opposite colors to split tone, where you're making a bold difference between the two tonal regions. But it's worth trying and is great fun on changing the mood of your image. So I'm liking the look of that now. I think we'll have slightly less in the shadows, so I'm just going to reduce the saturation of the shadows there, and then just beef up the highlights just a touch to get those cyans really kicking through. And I'm quite liking the break-off points I can see in the midtones where you switch between one color and the next. But they're so close together, I don't think a viewer would detect it. They just experience it. And of course, that emotional experience is what photography is all about when it comes to your viewer. So I hope that was useful. There's 3 ways you can introduce a sense of blueness into your images. The first was simply by using the color temperature slider to change the white balance of your picture. The second was when you have some context within the picture, you don't want to do that. Instead, use the color sliders and then maybe tweak the color temperature just to give that impression of blueness coming through. And the third method is when you've made a black and white picture, go into the split toning tab and apply some blueness to your black and white tones to establish a different mood and a different feel in your images. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.